Hi, I'm Stephen Power. I'm a photographer and teacher based on Valentia in County Kerry, Ireland. Welcome to my series of teaching videos. This one is about: do you really need to use manual exposure to be a good photographer? No, you really don't need manual exposure for good photographs. See you next time. Well, no, obviously it's not as simple as that. And this is a subject that a lot of photographers have very strong views on. There are serious photographers and professionals who really believe that the only setting that makes their photographs great is the manual exposure setting. I don't agree with that. I've been taking photographs and selling photographs since the late 1970s, and that's a very long time. I've used very basic manual cameras, a bit like this one, which I'm actually still using, and quite sophisticated digital cameras, medium format and large format cameras. And I rarely use the manual exposure setting in the camera other than when I'm in the studio with my main studio lights, and then it's essential to do that. Everywhere else I tend to use aperture priority and sometimes shutter priority if I'm photographing fast moving events. So at least I know that it works for me, and I think it can work for you as well, because it makes life a lot simpler. One of the things I have a problem with in terms of the manual exposure mode is that once you've set the aperture, then you need to set the shutter speed and then maybe adjust the ISO. So you've got three things to think about. Some photographers don't end up where they start off. So they might start with f16 and find that the shutter speed for that is too slow. So they change it, and eventually when the photograph's taken, they might end up with f5.6, or at least not where they wanted to start with in the first place. And that's the problem for me. Photography, I think, is about seeing the scene or imagining the scene in your head and then deciding what that's going to look like or how you're going to make the adjustments in the camera to show the viewer exactly what you've seen. And you have to know how to control the aperture, the shutter speed, and to a lesser extent the ISO to make that happen. My view is that the aperture is the most creative setting in the camera. It controls the depth of field. It controls how much of the image in front of and behind the subject is sharp. So a smaller aperture of, say, f16 will make a lot of the image sharp, and that's great for landscapes maybe. And for portraits, you might go to a wider aperture, f4, or even f1.8 or f1.4, if you want to make the background very blurry. If you are in aperture priority and you set that aperture, whatever it might be, it stays set. And then you can adjust the other settings to go with the aperture that you want. If that shutter speed doesn't work for you, then you increase the ISO until you get the shutter speed that you want. The point is that you've still got f11 because you think that's the setting that's going to give you the correct depth of field for the image that you want to show. If it doesn't, if you take the picture at f11 and it's not working, then you increase it or decrease it to the aperture that you think is going to work for you. With manual, it's a little bit more complicated. I think you might start mixing and matching. If you don't mix and match and then only control the aperture and the shutter speed, by all means stick with manual. But I find Aperture Priority lets me think about the aperture first and foremost. So I choose Aperture Priority. Now, a lot of people will say that manual exposure gives you the most control, and you can't get that sort of control any other way. You can. There's a little magic button on your DSLR and most other cameras as well, called the EV compensation dial, plus or minus button, maybe you want to call that. So it doesn't matter if you're in one of the semi-automatic modes, aperture priority, shutter priority, you can still have this infinite control over the exposure that you would with manual. This is my little recipe for perfect pictures. Think of the aperture that will make the scene look like you imagine it. Set that aperture. Check the shutter speed. If it's too slow to handhold the camera, if you don't have a tripod, or to stop motion, increase the ISO. Take the photograph. If it's then too dark or too bright, use the EV compensation dial, plus or minus button, and adjust the exposure, maybe 1/3 or 2/3 down, or 2/3 up, or 1/3 up. Take it again. You have controlled the shutter speed, you've controlled the ISO. The only thing then you need to change again next time is the aperture. You might want to go to a wider aperture to blur the background, smaller aperture to keep things in focus from front to back. And that's a very simple 3 or 4 step recipe, and it stops a lot of confusion. It adds as much control as you will ever need. So I hope this was helpful. Bye for now.